The year of our Lord, 1878, was drawing to a close, and with every clatter of the train wheels on the iron tracks, Elara Thompson felt a piece of her old life fall away like dust. Outside the grimy window, the world was changing. The last of the familiar, gentle greens of the East had surrendered days ago, replaced now by a landscape that seemed scraped clean by the sun. It was a vast, bleached expanse of brown and pale yellow, stretching out to a horizon so wide it made her feel small and utterly insignificant. Anxiety was a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach. It had been her constant companion for weeks, but out here, with the end of the line drawing near, it tightened its grip until she could barely draw a full breath. To quiet the rattle of the train, she closed her eyes, but that only made the voices louder. "You must understand. Elara, it is for your own good." Aunt Carol's voice, thin and sharp as a sewing needle. "A girl of your size cannot afford to be picky. You are a burden. Child. A plain, heavy girl with no prospects and no dowry. You should be grateful for any opportunity that comes your way, no matter how humble." Her aunt had taken her in after the fever claimed both her parents within a week of each other. Elara was 10 then, a soft, round child who became a soft, round woman under a roof where she was treated as little more than an unpaid servant. For a decade, she had earned her keep through endless chores, her aunt's pronouncements on her failings a constant litany. She was too slow, too quiet, and always too large. No man would look twice at her, her aunt would say, not when there were so many slender, graceful girls to choose from. The advertisement in the back pages of the newspaper had been a whisper of a possibility in a life that felt like a locked room. A rancher in the West, seeking a wife, a man of good standing, it said, owner of a sizable parcel of land, widowed, no children mentioned. It was a lie. She knew that he was of good standing and simply needed a wife. Men like that did not need to advertise. This was a man in need of a housekeeper he did not have to pay, a worker with hands and a strong back. He was a man who, like her, had run out of other options. The choice had been simple and brutal. Remain with her aunt, a life sentence of servitude and spinsterhood, or gamble everything she had on the unknown. She had chosen the gamble. Her hand tightened on the worn leather handle of the satchel on her lap. It held everything she owned in the world. A single change of clothes, a simple calico dress she had sewn herself, her mother's silver locket, now tarnished with age, its delicate chain cool against the skin of her palm, and tucked beneath it all, a small, stout book, its cover softened and stained from use. It was her mother's collection of recipes, the pages filled with a flowing, elegant script that Elara could barely remember being written. It was the only real inheritance she had. The journey itself was an ordeal, a rolling parade of her own shame. She felt the eyes of the other passengers on her as she moved down the narrow aisle, their gazes sliding over her broad shoulders and wide hips. They were not always unkind, but they were always looking, their curiosity a physical weight. A family with 2 well-dressed, slender daughters would watch her with a mixture of pity and faint disgust. A group of men heading west to seek their fortunes would fall silent as she passed, their speculative glances making her skin crawl. She had avoided the dining car entirely. The thought of sitting at a table, of lifting a fork to her mouth under the scrutiny of strangers, was unbearable. Instead, she subsisted on the dry, hard biscuits she had packed in her satchel, eating them quickly and furtively when she was sure no one was watching. Each crumb felt like a confession of some great, unspoken sin. Every mile the train devoured pushed her deeper into a wilderness that was both terrifying and strangely freeing. The sheer emptiness of the land was intimidating. There were no towns, no cozy farms, just an endless, rolling sea of grass under a sky so immense it seemed to have no edges. It felt as though the world had been stripped down to its barest essentials, earth and sky. Out here, the sky seemed too big, too vast, to have any room for the small, petty cruelties of the city. Out here, a person was judged not by the cut of their clothes or the breadth of their waist, but by their ability to simply survive, or so she hoped. It was a fragile, desperate hope, the only kind she had left. The train finally shuddered to a halt with a great hiss of steam and a screech of brakes. A man's voice called out, "Redemption! End of the line!" Ilara looked out the window. The name felt like a bitter joke. Redemption was little more than a single, wide street carved out of the dust. A handful of weathered wooden buildings stood hunched against the wind, a general store with a faded sign, a saloon whose swinging doors opened onto a dark interior, a blacksmith's forge from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoed. And, at the far end of the street, the stark white steeple of a small church. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she gathered her satchel and made her way to the door. When she stepped down from the train onto the splintered wooden platform, the heat hit her like a physical blow. It was a dry, searing heat that seemed to suck the moisture right out of her lungs. The air smelled of dust, horse manure, and something else, a wild, clean scent of sagebrush and dry earth. And then she saw him. He was standing near the small station house, apart from the few other men who had gathered to watch the train's arrival. He was unmistakable. He was taller than the others, with shoulders that seemed to strain the seams of his simple homespun shirt. There was a stillness about him, a rootedness that made him seem like a part of the landscape itself. He was not handsome in the way of the polished gentleman back east. His face was a map of his life, carved and weathered by sun and wind. His hair was the color of sun-scorched wheat, and his eyes, when they finally met hers, were a pale, guarded blue that seemed to hold a deep, permanent winter. She saw no welcome in them, no kindness. She saw only a profound and unshakable loneliness, a sorrow so deep it seemed to have settled into his very bones. This was Silas, her future husband, the man who had paid her passage. He watched her approach, his expression utterly unreadable. The rehearsed words she had practiced for 1,000 miles, a polite greeting, a thank you for the opportunity, died in her throat. All she could feel was the weight of his gaze as it moved over her, from the top of her plain bonnet down to the hem of her dusty dress. It was not a leering look, nor was it openly cruel. It was an assessment, as cold and practical as a rancher judging livestock at an auction. And in that look, she saw with absolute certainty what she had feared all along. He was disappointed. A wave of shame so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees washed over her. It was the same shame that had haunted her for her entire life. The familiar, bitter taste of being found wanting. All the hope she had nurtured, the fragile idea that out here, things might be different, crumbled into dust. And in her desperation, the words that had been both her shield and her shame tumbled out. "I know I am not what you likely hoped for," she began, her voice a raw, trembling whisper that was nearly lost in the prairie wind. The confession, spoken aloud, was a fresh agony. "No one marries a fat girl, sir. But I can cook, I can keep a house and mend, and I am a hard worker." The last words were thick with unshed tears, a final, desperate plea for him to see some value in her beyond the vessel she inhabited. Silas did not move. He did not speak. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The dust motes danced in the harsh afternoon sunlight, tiny, glittering specks in the space that separated their two lonely worlds. She braced herself for the dismissal, for the cold words that would send her back to the train, back to a life of humiliation. He would tell her there had been a mistake. He would demand his money back from the agent. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice was a low baritone, rough like gravel being dragged over stone. "This land doesn't care for pretty, Miss Thompson. It cares for what endures." His gaze was unwavering, his pale eyes boring into hers. He offered no hollow compliment, no polite lie. He offered only a hard, unvarnished truth. "Cooking is a start," he continued. "The work is hard and the winters are harder. Can you endure?" The question stunned her. It was not a question about her appearance, her manners, or her breeding. It was a question about her substance, about the strength of her spirit. It was the first time in her entire life that anyone had ever asked her if she was strong, rather than simply telling her that she was large. The distinction was a revelation, a tiny crack of light in a lifetime of darkness. A single, hot tear escaped her and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She swiped it away with the back of her hand and, for the first time, met his gaze without flinching. "I can," she said, and her voice, though quiet, was steady. The wagon ride to his ranch was conducted in a near-total silence. Silas handled the horses with an easy, practiced competence, his large hands gentle on the reins. Elara sat beside him on the hard wooden bench, clutching her satchel, acutely aware of the space between them. The landscape they passed through was brutally beautiful. The vast plains gave way to rolling, rugged hills dotted with scrubby trees and dramatic rock formations. The sky was an endless, aching blue. It was a lonely country, a place that demanded fortitude and offered little comfort in return. The ranch was miles from town, a solitary homestead nestled in a shallow valley, dwarfed by the immense sky and the surrounding hills. The house was a sturdy, practical structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney at one end. A large barn and several smaller outbuildings stood nearby. It was a place built for survival, not for beauty. Inside, the house was stark and lacking any softness or warmth. The main room consisted of a large stone hearth, a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves on the wall. The floors were scrubbed clean, the surfaces free of dust. But it felt empty. It was the kind of clean that comes not from diligent housekeeping, but from a lack of living. This was not a home. It was a shelter inhabited by ghosts. Silas led her to a small room off the main living area. It contained a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden chest for her belongings, and a single window that looked out onto the unforgiving hills. "This will be yours," he said, his tone flat and impersonal. The implication was clear. Theirs was an arrangement of convenience, a business transaction. There would be no intimacy, no shared bed. She was here to work, and this was where she would sleep. He left her then, closing the door softly behind him, and the silence of the house rushed in to fill the space he had vacated. Elara's first days on the ranch were a whirlwind of frantic activity. She was determined to prove her worth, to show him that his gamble on her was not a mistake. She threw herself into the work with a desperate energy, as if she could scrub away her own insecurities along with the dirt. She scrubbed floors that were already clean. She beat rugs that held no dust. She washed the single set of curtains and hung them in the sun until they were stiff and smelled of lye soap and fresh air. Her greatest efforts were reserved for the kitchen. Using the meager supplies in the pantry, she worked magic. She baked bread every morning, filling the stark, silent house with its warm, yeasty scent. She made hearty stews and simple, satisfying meals that he ate with a silent, stoic appreciation. He never offered a word of praise, but he cleaned his plate at every meal. And for Elara, that was enough. She was trying to fill the vast, echoing silence of the house with the sounds and smells of domesticity, hoping to chase away the ghosts that lingered in every corner. She began to learn the geography of his grief without him ever speaking a word of it. She noticed the way his eyes would sometimes drift to a particular rocking chair that sat empty by the hearth. A chair he never sat in, and she instinctively knew not to touch. She saw the faint, faded patch on the log wall near the fireplace, a small rectangle of lighter wood where a child's drawing or a framed photograph might once have hung. The house was a map of absences, and she was slowly learning to read it. The source of the ghosts was revealed to her a week after her arrival. It was a blustery afternoon, and she had taken it upon herself to give the entire house a thorough cleaning, including his room. She entered his sleeping quarters with a sense of trepidation. It was as sparse as her own, Containing only a large bed, a washstand, and a heavy wooden wardrobe, it felt like a sacred, private space, and she felt like an intruder. As she was dusting the wardrobe, a sudden, fierce gust of wind rattled the window pane and blew through a crack in the frame. The gust caught the unlatched lid of a small wooden chest that sat at the foot of his bed, blowing it open with a soft thud. Curiosity warred with her sense of propriety. She hesitated, then took a step closer. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded white linen, lay two small, heartbreaking items. The first was a tiny pair of leather baby shoes, the soles scuffed as if from the first tentative steps of a toddler. Beside them was a woman's hairbrush, its back made of delicate, tarnished silver, intricately carved with vines and flowers. A few long, fine strands of dark hair were still tangled in its bristles. The sight hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was not just a wife he had lost. It was a child, too. The emptiness of the house suddenly made a terrible, perfect sense. The silence was not just emptiness. It was a hollow space carved out by a loss so profound it had consumed all the air and light. She understood now that she was not the first woman of this house, and the ghosts had names. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just above the tiny shoes. An overwhelming wave of sorrow washing over her. Sorrow for the man who lived with this gaping wound. For the woman who had brushed her hair with that silver brush. For the child who would never grow to fill those little shoes. "What are you doing in here?" The voice was cold and hard as iron. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas was standing in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. His face, usually a mask of stoic reserve, was now hardened with a sudden, sharp anger. His body was tense, coiled like a spring, ready for a confrontation. Ilara expected a furious outburst, an accusation of prying into things that were not her concern. She expected to be cast out, her bargain with him broken. Her throat went dry, and words failed her. All she could do was look at him, her eyes wide with fear and flooded with the tears that now streamed freely down her cheeks. Her own fear was forgotten, eclipsed by the sheer force of the grief she had unearthed. Her sorrow was not pity. It was a genuine, empathetic ache for a pain she could only begin to imagine. Looking from the crushing sadness in the chest to the raw anger on his face, she found her voice. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words ragged. "I am so sorry for your loss." Her simple, honest words, filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own, seemed to break through the hardened shell he had built around himself. The anger in his eyes did not so much fade as it shattered, replaced by a wave of raw, unguarded grief, so immense it seemed to stagger him. The fury had been a shield, and she had just walked right past it. He did not speak. He could not. He turned away from her abruptly and leaned his hand against the rough log wall. His head bowed, his broad back, usually so straight and unyielding, began to tremble with silent, wrenching sobs he had clearly held back for years. Ilara stood frozen in the middle of the room, her hand still outstretched over the open chest. She was a witness to a grief so private and profound it felt like a sacrilege to even look upon it. Yet, in that shared, silent moment of sorrow, something shifted between them. The fragile, tentative foundation of their bargain, built on necessity and desperation, gave way to something new. In the quiet space of his grief and her empathy, the first fragile stone of a real connection was laid. After that day in his room, the silence in the house changed. It had not vanished. Silas was not a man given to easy chatter, but its quality was different. Before, it had been a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief and loneliness. Now, it was something quieter, a shared space that seemed to hold a fragile understanding. He never mentioned the chest, and she never asked. The tiny shoes and the silver-backed brush were once again hidden from view, but their memory lingered, a testament to the sorrow they had, for a moment, witnessed together. The frantic desperation that had fueled Ilara's first week on the ranch began to subside. She no longer felt the burning need to scrub and bake and clean herself into a state of worthiness. The work was still her purpose, but she settled into a steady, comfortable rhythm, her movements sure and efficient. She was no longer just filling the silence. She was inhabiting it, making it her own. Behind the stark log house, she found a small, neglected patch of earth where the sun fell for most of the day. The soil was hard-packed and stubborn, choked with weeds and stones. But Ilara saw potential. With a rusty spade she found in the barn, she began to turn the earth. It was back-breaking work. The sun beat down on her, and sweat traced paths through the dust on her face. But she found a deep satisfaction in the labor. She was coaxing life from a patch of ground that everyone else had given up on. A quiet rebellion against the desolation of the landscape and the lingering sorrow within the home. Silas had watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. But when he returned from town one day, he left a small cloth sack on the kitchen table. Inside were seeds for beans, squash, and hardy greens. He said nothing, but the gesture was as loud as a proclamation. Silas, in turn, began to watch her. His gaze was no longer the critical assessment of an employer measuring the value of his purchase. It was a quiet, unfolding curiosity. He had contracted for a housekeeper who could cook, and she was that and more. Her meals were simple but deeply nourishing, a constant, reliable comfort at the end of his long days. But he started to notice things beyond her skills in the kitchen. He saw the way she spoke to the chickens as she scattered their feed, her voice a low, gentle murmur. He noticed the infinite patience she had with an old mare that had a lame leg, the way she would stroke the horse's muzzle and speak to it softly as she changed its dressing. He saw the determined set of her jaw as she wrestled a particularly stubborn rock from her garden plot, her face grim with effort, but her spirit unyielding. He had told her on that first day that the land cared for what endures. He was beginning to see that the strength he had glimpsed in her was deeper and more resilient than he could have imagined. It was not a brittle strength, but a pliable one, like a willow that bends in the wind but does not break. A few weeks later, a small crisis brought that strength into sharp focus. One of his cows gave birth to a calf, a scrawny, weak thing that it immediately rejected. The mother, a first-timer, wanted nothing to do with it, pushing it away with her great head whenever it struggled near. The calf was failing fast, its cries growing weaker. Silas found it shivering in a corner of the barn, its life already fading. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. It was the way of things. The land gave, and the land took. He went to get his rifle, intending to put the poor creature out of its misery quickly. Ilara met him at the barn door, her face pale. "What are you doing?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the rifle in his hand. "It's no good," he said, his voice flat. "The mother won't take it. It's starving. This is the kindest thing." "No," she said, her voice firm but gentle. She stepped past him into the barn. "Let me try it, please." Silas looked at her, at the plea in her eyes. He had seen it a dozen times before. A weak calf was a lost calf. Wasting time and effort on it was a fool's errand. But there was something in her expression, a fierce, nurturing resolve, that made him hesitate. He lowered the rifle. "It will not work," he said. But it was not a command. For the next 2 days and nights, Ilara barely slept. She brought the tiny calf into a warm, hay-filled stall and wrapped it in old blankets. She patiently coaxed its mouth open, feeding it drop by drop with a clean rag soaked in warm milk from another cow. She spoke to it constantly, her voice a low, encouraging hum. She held its shivering body against her own, lending it her warmth and her will to live. Silas watched from a distance. He saw her exhaustion, the dark circles that appeared under her eyes. But he also saw an unwavering dedication that baffled him. He remained skeptical, expecting each morning to find that the calf had passed in the night, but it did not. On the third morning, he entered the barn to find the calf standing on its own wobbly legs. nudging impatiently at Alara's hand for its milk. He found her a few moments later, fast asleep in a pile of clean hay, her head pillowed on her arm. The healthy calf was nestled beside her, its small body rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. A profound stillness settled over Silas as he looked at them. He felt a flicker of warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost did not recognize it. It was not gratitude, not precisely. It was admiration, pure and simple, in her quiet, stubborn way. She had refused to accept the harsh verdict of the land. She had fought for this small life and won. Without a sound, he slipped off his heavy canvas coat, the one that smelled of leather and dust and him, and gently draped it over her shoulders before turning and leaving her to her well-earned rest. A week later, they made their first trip to Redemption together. The wagon needed a new axle, and their supplies of flour and salt were running low. As they hitched the horses, a new, almost shy sense of companionship had settled between them. But the moment they arrived in the dusty main street, the familiar cold dread settled back into Alara's stomach. The world outside the sanctuary of the ranch was just as she remembered it. As they walked toward the general store, she felt the eyes on her. Two women, standing on the porch of the dressmaker's shop, stopped their conversation to stare, their whispers buzzing in the air like flies. A group of men loafing outside the saloon paused their game of checkers, and one of them smirked, nudging his companion. The fragile peace she had so carefully cultivated over the past weeks began to crumble. All the old shame, the feeling of being too much, of taking up too much space in the world, came rushing back. She instinctively shrank into herself, her shoulders hunching forward as if to make herself smaller, her eyes fixed on the dusty planks of the boardwalk beneath her feet. "Well, Silas, fancy seeing you in town." The voice was slick and overly friendly, with a sharp, cruel edge hiding just beneath the surface. Alara looked up to see a man sauntering toward them. He was the opposite of Silas in every way. Where Silas was weathered and still, this man was handsome in a polished, preening way, his clothes too fine for a working rancher. His smile was wide, but it never reached his eyes, which held a cold, calculating glint. "Thorn," Silas acknowledged, his voice flat. He made no move to offer his hand. The man, Thorn, gave Silas a mocking look before letting his eyes roam over Alara in a slow, deliberately insulting appraisal. His gaze lingered on her frame, and a sneer curled his lip. "Well, Silas," Thorn said, his voice loud enough for the whispering women and the smirking men to hear clearly. "I see you found yourself some sturdy help." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. A man needs a wide shadow to work a ranch that size. The insult was as clear and brutal as a slap in the face. Heat flooded Alara's cheeks, a burning wave of humiliation. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. This was it. This was the judgment she had been running from, and it had found her here, in this dusty little town at the edge of nowhere. But Silas's reaction was not what she expected. He did not flush with anger or shame. He did not raise his voice or ball his fists. His response was far quicker and far more chilling. He simply took a half step forward, a small, almost imperceptible movement that placed him slightly in front of Alara, shielding her from Thorn's venomous gaze. He looked directly at Jebediah Thorn, and the pale, wintry blue of his eyes turned to chips of ice. "Thorn," he said, and his voice was dangerously low, a gravelly rumble that promised violence more effectively than any shout. "You will not speak to my wife again." The words hung in the hot, still air, stark and absolute. My wife, not my help, not Miss Thompson. My wife. It was a claiming, a public declaration that echoed down the single street of Redemption. He then placed a large, firm hand on the small of Alara's back, a gesture that was both a claiming and a shielding, and steered her firmly toward the entrance of the general store, leaving Thorn standing on the boardwalk. For once in his life, looking momentarily stunned and speechless. Inside the store, amidst the smells of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples, Alara was trembling. Her body was racked with a confusing storm of emotions. The shame from Thorne's cruel words was a raw, open wound, but beneath it, a strange, fluttering warmth was spreading through her chest, a warmth that came from Silas's quiet, powerful defense of her. She expected him to be angry with her, to blame her for causing a scene. She was, after all, the source of his public embarrassment. Instead, he released her and turned to the storekeeper, his voice calm and even as he began to recite his list of supplies. A sack of flour, 20 pounds of salt, a new axe handle. He moved through the store with a quiet purpose, his presence a solid, reassuring barrier between her and the prying eyes of the other customers. He had drawn a line in the dust, and she was on his side of it. He had publicly acknowledged her not as his housekeeper, not as his bargain, but as his wife. That single word changed everything. The ride home was quiet for the first few miles, but it was a different silence than before. It was filled with the unspoken weight of what had happened in town. As the wagon rumbled along, Silas finally broke it, his gaze fixed on the horizon, on the familiar, rugged shapes of the hills that marked the boundary of his land. "Thorne and I have history," he said, his voice rough. "His venom has little to do with you." It was not an apology for Thorne's behavior, nor was it a flowery reassurance. It was a simple statement of fact, a clumsy, masculine attempt to protect her feelings, to lift the burden of Thorne's cruelty from her shoulders and place it onto his own. For Alara, who had never had anyone stand up for her, let alone try to shield her from emotional harm, it was a gift. She simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. A few nights later, the land decided to test them. A savage, unseasonal blizzard descended upon the ranch with a shocking, brutal speed. The day had been cool but clear, and they had been caught completely unprepared. The wind rose from a whisper to a demonic howl in less than an hour, and the snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain that buried the world in a sea of white. The temperature plummeted. The wind shrieked around the corners of the log house like a vengeful spirit. It was the kind of storm that could kill a man in minutes if he was caught out in it. Their most valuable livestock, the core of their herd, were in the main barn. Suddenly, a sound like a great crack of thunder echoed above the howl of the wind. A heavy beam in the barn roof, groaning under the unforeseen weight of the wet, heavy snow, had splintered. Silas grabbed his coat and lantern. "A section of the roof is threatening to collapse," he shouted over the din. "We have to get the animals out." There was no time for discussion, no room for fear. This was a battle for their survival, and the storm was a relentless enemy. Alara was right behind him, pulling on her own coat and wrapping a heavy shawl over her head. The moment they stepped outside, the force of the wind and snow stole their breath. It was a chaotic, freezing darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, swinging light of Silas's lantern. The storm stripped away all pretense, all emotional distance that remained between them. They were no longer a grieving rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two people, a man and a woman, fighting together against a common, merciless foe. Silas shouted instructions over the wind, his voice a raw command, and Alara followed without hesitation. Her physical size, the source of so much shame, became an asset. She was strong, and her body was insulated against the biting cold. She hauled timber to brace the failing wall, her muscles straining with the effort. She helped Silas force open the snow-drifted doors, her weight adding to his. She moved among the panicked, lowing cattle, her voice calm and soothing, her steady presence helping to quiet their terror as Silas guided them out of the collapsing section and into a more secure pen. It was her practical mind that thought to run back to the house through the blizzard, returning with a flask of hot, strong coffee that they drank in shivering gulps. the warmth a small weapon against the encroaching, deadly cold. At one point, as they worked to secure a loose gate against the punishing wind, her foot slipped on a treacherous patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. She cried out as she fell, but before she could hit the ground, Silas was there. He caught her, his powerful arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her securely against his chest. For a moment, they stood frozen, pressed together in the heart of the maelstrom. The wind howled around them, but in that small space between their bodies, there was only the surprising, intense warmth of their shared heat. Her hands were flat against his chest, and she could feel the frantic, steady beat of his heart beneath the thick wool of his shirt. He was solid, real, a bastion against the chaos. In the wild, flickering light of the lantern, their eyes met. His were no longer guarded or distant. They were filled with the same adrenaline, the same fierce will to survive that coursed through her own veins. In that shared moment of mutual reliance, something powerful and unspoken arced between them. The polite, careful distance they had maintained for weeks was obliterated by the storm. The physical barrier was broken. He held her a second longer than necessary before steadying her on her feet. "Be careful," he rasped, his voice rough with more than just the cold. They worked until dawn. As the first pale gray light began to filter through the thinning snow, the wind finally began to lose its fury. They stood together in the lee of the barn, exhausted, freezing, their clothes stiff with ice, and surveyed what they had saved. The barn was damaged, but standing. The livestock were safe. They had faced the storm and, together, they had won. They were no longer just a man and a woman living in the same house, bound by a piece of paper. They were partners. And as they turned to walk back to the warmth and safety of the home they had fought to protect, they moved in a new, unspoken unison. The days that followed the great blizzard were filled with the hard labor of repair. The broken beam in the barn had to be replaced, fences mended, and the rhythm of the ranch restored. But as they worked, a new, unspoken rhythm was being established between them. The ordeal had burned away the last of the formal distance. They moved around each other in the small house with a comfortable, easy familiarity that had not existed before. The silence was no longer a void, but a shared quiet, punctuated by the small sounds of two people living and working in unison. Something else lingered in the air between them, the memory of that moment in the storm, of being pressed together, a pocket of warmth and life in the heart of the freezing chaos. That spark of physical awareness remained, charging the small spaces of their daily lives. A simple, accidental brush of his hand against hers as she passed him a plate of food at the dinner table sent a jolt through her. A shared glance across the room, his pale blue eyes meeting hers as she sat mending one of his shirts by the firelight, held a new and unspoken meaning. They were acutely aware of each other in a way that was both unsettling and deeply thrilling. The storm had changed Alara. She had faced down the raw, killing power of the land and had not been found wanting. She had proven her strength, not just in the kitchen or the garden, but in a true crisis where their very survival had been at stake. A quiet confidence began to take root in her, blossoming slowly but surely. She was no longer just the cook, the housekeeper, a woman grateful for a roof over her head. She was a partner in this enterprise, and she began to act like one. One morning at breakfast, she spoke up, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength. "Silas," she began, "I was looking at the north pasture yesterday. The grass is getting thin. If we move the herd to the western slope for a few weeks, the north field will have time to recover before the summer heat sets in." Silas stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had never asked for her opinion on the running of the ranch, but he did not dismiss her. He considered her words, his gaze distant as he pictured the fields in his mind. "The creek runs lower on the western slope," he said, stating a fact, not a rebuttal. "It does," she agreed readily. "But the spring rains were good. There is enough water for now, and it will save the better pasture for later, when we might need it more." He was silent for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. "It is a good thought," he said. Later that day, he moved the cattle. It was the first of many such conversations. She pointed out a section of fence that was weakening near the posts, suggesting it be mended before it broke entirely and allowed livestock to wander. She noticed a sickness in the chickens before he did, and knew an old remedy of herbs to add to their water. Her observations were always practical, always insightful. Silas found himself listening, and more than that, he found himself valuing what he heard. He had sought a woman who could endure. He was beginning to realize he had found something far rarer, an intelligent partner, a woman whose quiet wisdom was as valuable as the strength in her back. But this new closeness, this growing respect and admiration, became a source of intense and private torment for Silas. The more he saw of Alara, the more he found himself watching her. He was a man who had locked away a part of his heart, intending for it to remain sealed forever. But she was, with her quiet strength and gentle ways, slowly and unknowingly picking the lock. He would find his eyes drawn to the way a few strands of her chestnut hair would always manage to escape their severe pins as she worked, curling softly at the nape of her neck. He watched the graceful, efficient movement of her hands as she kneaded bread, her fingers sure and capable. When she bent over the rows of her burgeoning garden, the sunlight catching the gentle curve of her hips and the solid strength of her back, he felt a deep, stirring of desire he thought had been buried years ago beneath a mountain of snow and sorrow. It was a feeling he had never expected to have again, and it terrified him. The desire was a betrayal. Each time he felt that pull toward her, a profound and suffocating guilt would wash over him. This house was not just a house. It was a shrine to the life he had lost. Every wall, every floorboard, held a memory of his first wife, Mary. He could still see her sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, her dark hair shining, a gentle smile on her face. He could still hear the echoes of his son Jacob's laughter, the phantom sound of small feet running across the wooden floor. His heart felt like a sacred tomb, and this new feeling, this desire for Alara, felt like a desecration, a violation of their memory. This inner turmoil made him withdraw, just as a tentative warmth had begun to settle between them. He snuffed it out. He became moody and distant again, reverting to the silent, brooding man she had first met on the train platform. His answers to her questions became clipped and short. He took his meals in a tense, heavy silence, his eyes fixed on his plate, the shared glances, the small, comfortable moments, all vanished, replaced by a painful, yawning chasm. Alara was confused and deeply hurt by his sudden coldness. One moment, he was listening to her counsel and looking at her with something akin to warmth. The next, he was a stranger again, a man behind a wall of ice. She replayed their conversations, their every interaction, searching for her mistake. Had she overstepped her bounds? Had she presumed too much? Perhaps their partnership in the storm had been a fluke, a temporary alliance born of necessity. Perhaps now, in the calm light of day, he regretted the closeness it had forged. The fear that he was simply biding his time until he could send her away returned with a vengeance. The tension in the small house became unbearable, a thick, suffocating presence. One evening, after a dinner eaten in near complete silence, Alara could stand it no longer. Silas had risen from the table without a word and gone to stand by the main window, staring out into the deepening twilight. She knew what he was looking at, on a small, wind-swept hill not far from the house. Two simple wooden crosses stood starkly against the fading purple and orange of the sky. It was a place he often looked toward, but tonight his posture was different. His shoulders slumped under a weight she could feel from across the room. She dried her hands on her apron, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She could not live like this, suspended in this painful uncertainty. She walked softly across the room and came to stand a few feet behind him. "Talk to me, Silas," she pleaded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, whatever it is, do not shut me out." Her quiet strength, the same strength that had saved his calf and stood with him in the blizzard, seemed to grant him the permission he needed to finally let the wall crumble. For a long time, he remained silent, his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with a pain so old and so deep it seemed to have been torn from the very center of his soul. "There was a storm," he began, his voice raspy and low, "just like the one we had unseasonal. It came on fast." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "I was in town for supplies. I should not have gone. The sky looked strange, but we needed flour. Mary, she said they would be fine." He turned from the window then, and in the dim light from the lamp, she could see that his face was a mask of anguish. His stoic control was gone, stripped away. "It was a 4-year-old's birthday," he continued, his voice breaking. "My son, Jacob. I was buying him a gift, a small carved horse. I was gone too long. The storm hit, and I tried to get back, but the snow was too deep. The horse bolted, the wagon overturned. It took me all night to walk home." He stopped, his throat working. Elara stood utterly still, her heart breaking for him. "I found them in the barn," he finally choked out, the words ripped from him. "They must have gone to check on the animals. The door blew shut and the latch was jammed with ice. They were trapped. Mary. She had taken off her coat, her shawl, everything, and wrapped it around Jacob. She had her own body wrapped around him." He looked at Elara, his pale eyes swimming with tears that had been held back for years. "But it was not enough. They were frozen, both of them, and it was my fault. I was not here to protect them. I was in town, buying a toy horse, while my family froze to death." The confession hung in the air, a story of horror and unimaginable grief. When he finished, his stoic facade had completely crumbled. Silent tears tracked through the dust on his weathered cheeks. Elara did not offer him empty platitudes or hollow comforts. She did not tell him it was God's will or that he had to be strong. She simply listened, absorbing the full weight of his pain, her own tears falling in silent sympathy. She stepped forward and gently, tentatively, reached out and took his large, calloused hand in both of her own. His skin was cold as ice. "That was a tragedy, Silas," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that matched his own. "A terrible, terrible tragedy. But it was not a failing. You are not to blame for the cruelty of the weather. You are not to blame for a faulty latch." She squeezed his hand, willing her own warmth into him. Then she looked him directly in the eye and spoke the words that would begin to heal the deepest part of his wound. "I am not Mary," she said softly, but with a fierce certainty. "And I will never try to be. Her place in your heart is hers, and it is hers alone. But this ranch, this life, it is big enough for new things to grow alongside the old. You do not have to erase their memory to make a space for me." Her wisdom, her profound and simple empathy, acted as a key. It slid into the lock of the tomb he had built around his heart and turned, letting in the first glimmer of light he had seen in years. He looked at her then as if seeing her for the very first time. He saw not a replacement for the woman he had lost. He saw not a housekeeper or a bargain bride. He saw Elara, a woman of incredible, quiet strength. A woman of boundless compassion who was not asking him to forget his past, but offering him a way to finally live with it. He was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion, gratitude for her understanding, relief from the crushing weight of his guilt, and a powerful, undeniable desire for the woman standing before him, holding his hand, offering him a future. He closed the small distance between them. With his free hand, he reached up and gently framed her face, his calloused thumbs wiping away the tears that stained her cheeks. "Elara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips, the first time he had spoken it with such reverence. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of simple passion, though passion was there, a deep current running beneath the surface. It was a kiss of profound emotional release. It was a kiss of acceptance, of shared sorrow, and of a desperate, fragile, beautiful new beginning. It tasted of salt and grief and hope. When the kiss broke, he did not release her. He kept his hands on her face, his pale eyes searching hers, and in them, she saw a question. She answered it with a small, trembling nod. He took her hand and led her from the main room, past the cold and empty hearth, to the door of his bedroom, a room she had not entered since that first fateful day. He pushed the door open and led her inside. The consummation of their marriage was not a frantic, hurried act. It was a slow, sacred discovery, a healing. For Ilara, who had spent a lifetime feeling ashamed of her body, it was a revelation. For the first time, she was touched not with judgment or mere acceptance, but with reverence and a deep, aching desire. In his arms, under his hands, her size was not a flaw. Her softness was a comfort, her strength a marvel. She was cherished not in spite of her body, but because of it. Years of shame melted away under the gentle, worshipful attention of his touch. For Silas, it was an act of immense courage, a conscious and deliberate choice to step out of the tomb of his past. With every touch, every kiss, he was choosing to live again, to feel again, to love again. He was not replacing Mary. He was allowing his broken heart to make room for a new and different kind of love, one forged in hardship and understanding. In the soft lamplight of the quiet room, two lonely, broken people, scarred by the harshness of the world, found a profound solace. They found a fierce, passionate connection that promised not to erase their wounds, but to finally begin to heal them. The morning dawned soft and quiet, the world scrubbed clean by the departing storm. Inside the small log house, a new, fragile intimacy had taken root in the night. The air itself felt different, warmer, holding not the chill of sorrow, but the gentle heat of a shared hearth. When Ilara awoke, she was cocooned in the warmth of Silas's arms, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in her life, she felt not just safe, but cherished. The ghosts of the past were still present, she knew. The memory of Mary and Jacob was woven into the very logs of the house, a quiet, sorrowful thread in the tapestry of their lives. But they were no longer threatening specters lurking in the shadows. They were memories, held in a home that was, finally, alive again. The silence that greeted the dawn was not one of emptiness, but of peaceful contentment. Navigating this new reality was a delicate dance of awkwardness and discovery. They were no longer just partners in survival, a man and a woman bound by a practical arrangement. They were husband and wife in the truest and most intimate sense of the word, and they were shy as schoolchildren in their newfound affection. Ilara found herself blushing whenever his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long across the breakfast table. Silas, a man accustomed to solitude, found himself inventing reasons to be near her, his hand brushing her back as he passed behind her chair, his voice a low rumble as he pointed out a hawk circling in the sky, simply to share the moment with her. But in the unforgiving landscape of the West, happiness was often a fleeting and fragile thing, a tender green shoot in a land of rock and dust. Their newfound peace was quickly threatened by a shadow from without. Jebediah Thorne had not missed the change in his rival. He had seen the way Silas stood a little straighter, the way the deep-set lines of grief around his eyes had softened almost imperceptibly. More than that, he had witnessed Silas's public and possessive defense of Ilara in town. Thorne, a man whose own prosperity was built on bullying and corner-cutting, was consumed by a bitter envy of Silas for his unyielding resilience, for the prime land he refused to sell, and now, most gallingly, for the genuine affection that was clearly blossoming in his quiet, isolated home. Thorne's envy festered into a deep and abiding malice. He began a quiet but vicious campaign of sabotage, starting with the only weapon he could wield from a distance: words. On his next trip to redemption, he spun tales in the saloon and the general store. He painted Silas as a desperate fool, a man so broken by grief he had been duped by the first mail-order bride to answer his call. He described Alara with a sneer, painting a picture of a slovenly, desperate woman who had trapped a lonely man, insinuating that the ranch was falling into disrepair under her lazy care. The whispers spread like prairie fire, poisoning the well of public opinion. When words proved insufficient to satisfy his spite, Thorne's sabotage escalated into a direct and devastating attack on their livelihood. The spring rains had been sparse, and the long, hot days of early summer were quickly drying out the land. A burgeoning dry spell was settling over the region, making every drop of water a precious commodity. The creek that flowed down from the hills, bisecting Thorne's property before it reached Silas's, was their lifeline. One moonless night, Thorne and two of his hired men rowed out to a narrow point in the creek, just inside the border of his own land. Using felled timber, rocks, and packed earth, they worked for hours, constructing a crude but brutally effective dam. By sunrise, the steady, life-giving flow of water that fed Silas's pastures and home was reduced to a muddy, pathetic trickle. The effect was not immediate, but it was swift. Within a week, Silas's cattle, their tongues thick with thirst, began to bawl with a low, miserable sound. The pasture grass, which had been holding its own against the dry spell, began to turn a sickly yellow, then a brittle, lifeless brown. The kitchen garden that Alara had so carefully and lovingly tended, her small patch of defiant life, began to wither under the relentless sun. The bean leaves curled and blackened, the squash vines drooped, and the earth cracked like old pottery. Their survival, which they had fought so hard to secure against the indifference of the nature, was now in jeopardy from the deliberate cruelty of another man. They fought back with a grim, exhausting determination. Every day, Silas would hitch the horses to the wagon and haul water by the barrel from a distant, shared well, a back-breaking all-day task that yielded barely enough to keep the animals alive. Alara carefully rationed the water for the house, saving every precious drop to try and keep her garden from dying completely. It was in the midst of this grueling struggle that a letter arrived, carried by a mail rider making his monthly rounds. It was from her Aunt Carol. The very sight of the familiar, pinched handwriting on the envelope sent a chill of apprehension through Alara. She opened it with trembling fingers. The letter was a masterpiece of casual cruelty, a poisoned dart sent from 1,000 miles away. Her aunt, it seemed, had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Alara had managed to trap a husband out west. The pages were filled with the same old taunts, sharpened now with a new, condescending pity. Her aunt wrote of her shock that any man would have her, speculating that he must be simple-minded or desperate. She filled the lines with thinly veiled insults about Alara's weight and her worthlessness, predicting with smug certainty that Silas would soon grow tired of his hefty burden and cast her aside when he realized his grave mistake. Every word was designed to strike at Alara's most vulnerable insecurities, to remind her that she was, and always would be, the plain, heavy girl who was a burden to everyone. The fragile confidence she had built, her newfound sense of her own value, threatened to shatter. The cruel words of her aunt echoed the sneers of Jebediah Thorne, creating a terrible harmony of disdain that threatened to undo all the progress she had made. She tried to hide the letter, to burn it in the stove and scatter the ashes, but the poison was already in her veins. That evening, Silas came in from another exhausting day of hauling water to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the crumpled pages clutched in her hand, silent tears streaming down her face. He stopped in the doorway, his weary expression instantly replaced by one of sharp concern. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her chair. "Alara, what is it?" She could not speak. She could only shake her head. the tears coming faster now, a storm of all her old shame and hurt. He gently, insistently, took the crumpled letter from her hand. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and his face, already grim, became a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. It was not the quiet, contained anger he had shown Thorne in town. This was a deep, personal rage, a fire that burned in the icy depths of his eyes. He read the entire letter, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. When he was done, he did not look at the letter. He looked at Alara, and she saw with a jolt of surprise that he was not angry at her. He was enraged on her behalf, furious at the lifetime of casual, cutting cruelty she had been forced to endure. He remained kneeling before her and took both of her hands in his. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "The words of a bitter, small woman have no place in this house. They have no place in your heart." He looked down at the letter in his hand with utter contempt, then met her eyes again. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You endured a life with a woman like that. You endured a journey to an unknown place. You have stood against storms and hardship, and you have never, ever broken." He squeezed her hands, his gaze unwavering. "You are the heart of this ranch. Alara, you brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life. You are my wife." He took a breath, his voice thick with emotion. "Do not let her poison touch what we have built here." His words were a shield, a balm, a declaration of war against the ghosts of her past. He saw her not as her aunt did, not as Thorne did, but as she was, strong, resilient, and worthy. His unconditional defense of her against the prejudice of her own family was a final, binding seal on their relationship. In that moment, they were no longer just a husband and wife fighting for their ranch. They were a unified, unbreakable alliance, fighting for their home and their future against all the forces, past and present, that sought to diminish them. That night, they lay awake, the weight of their predicament settling upon them. "We cannot keep hauling water," Silas said into the darkness. "The well is low, and the work will kill the horses before the drought kills the cattle. I will have to face Thorne." "He wants you to," Alara said, her voice quiet but clear. "He wants you to come at him with a rifle. It is what he understands. But if you do that, Silas, even if you win, you will lose. The law will see you as the aggressor." An idea, faint at first, then gaining clarity, began to form in her mind. It was born of her practical nature, of the hours she had spent walking the land, learning its contours and its history. "When I was planting the garden," she said slowly, "I found an old stone marker half buried near the creek bed, a long way from the main fence line. It had carvings on it, letters and numbers." Silas was silent, listening. "I have heard the old-timers in town talk," she continued, "about the original land surveys, about how the boundaries shifted after a dispute years ago. I remember them mentioning easements, old rights-of-way that were forgotten. What if that marker, what if your property line runs differently than you think? What if Thorne's dam is not on his land at all?" The next morning, they rode out together, not toward town for the sheriff, and not armed for a gunfight. They rode toward the upper creek, following the dry, cracked bed. After an hour of searching, they found it. A short, square pillar of granite, nearly swallowed by sagebrush, its carved markings almost illegible with age. It was a surveyor's marker, and it stood a good 50 yards on their side of where Thorne had built his dam. They rode on, their expressions grim and determined. They found Thorne and his men at the dam, reinforcing it with more rocks, their laughter echoing in the quiet canyon. Thorne's smile was one of pure, gloating triumph when he saw them approach. "Come to beg for a drink, Silas?" he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Or did you bring your pretty wife to persuade me?" His men snickered. Silas dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. Alara swung down from her own horse, her heart pounding but her resolve firm as stone. They expected him to draw a weapon, to resort to the violence that was the common currency of men like Thorn. Instead, Silas walked calmly toward the bank of the creek, his eyes scanning the brush. He stopped and pointed with the toe of his boot at the top of another granite marker, nearly identical to the one they had found earlier. "You have built this on my land, Jebediah," Silas stated, his voice perfectly level, carrying an authority more potent than any threat. "This is not just theft of water, it is trespassing." Thorn scoffed, his bravado returning. "That is an old marker, worthless. The fence line is the boundary, and you know it." "The law knows what a surveyor's mark means," Silas replied, his voice still calm. It was then that Alara spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense air. She was devoid of the fear that once would have paralyzed her. She looked directly at Thorn. "And when Sheriff Miller comes out to look at the marker, he will already be in a curious state of mind." Thorn narrowed his eyes at her. "What are you talking about, woman?" "He will be interested to know," Alara continued, her voice never wavering, "that your new cattle brand, the one with the lazy T, looks remarkably similar to the one used by the Anderson family, right before their herd went missing last spring." It was a calculated bluff, a dangerous gamble based on nothing more than fragmented whispers and gossip she had overheard at the general store. But she delivered it with such quiet, unshakable confidence that Thorn faltered. The color drained from his face. She had taken the very tool of gossip that had been used against her and turned it into a weapon for justice. The combination was too much for him. The legitimate legal claim of trespassing was a problem, but the threat of a deeper investigation into his other, shadier dealings was a potential disaster. Jebediah Thorn, at his core, was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward when faced with a real fight he could not be certain of winning. His face contorted in a mask of pure, frustrated rage. He glared at Silas, then at Alara, his eyes filled with a new, hateful respect for the woman he had so casually dismissed. Fuming and utterly defeated, he spat on the ground. "Tear it down!" he snarled at his stunned men. Silas and Alara stood side by side and watched as Thorn's men, sullen and angry, began to dismantle their own handiwork. They pulled away the logs, rolled back the rocks, and broke the seal of packed earth. And then it came, a trickle at first, then a surge, as the lifeblood of the land was released. The water began to flow down the dry creek bed, a silver ribbon of hope, a symbol of their victory. They had won, not with fists or with bullets, but with intelligence, unity, and a courage that came from a place deeper than pride. They mounted their horses and turned for home, the sound of the returning creek a joyful song behind them. They rode back to their ranch not just as husband and wife who had survived another trial, but as formidable partners who had learned they could face down any shadow. So long as they faced it together, news in a small town like Redemption travels faster than a tumbleweed in a high wind. The story of the confrontation at the creek, however, traveled differently than most gossip. Thorn's hired men, sullen and resentful at being outsmarted, told a version of the story in the saloon that, despite its bitterness, could not hide the core facts. Silas had not drawn a weapon, and his wife, the large woman from the east, had faced down Jebediah Thorn with nothing but sharp words and a sharper mind. The tale spread, and with it, a profound shift in the community's perception began. Respect for Silas, the quiet, grieving rancher who kept to himself, deepened into a new kind of admiration. He was not just a survivor. He was a man of principle and quiet strength who had refused to be baited into a foolish, violent conflict, and a new, grudging admiration for his shrewd and steady wife began to take root. The whispers about Alara's size, the cruel jokes about her being sturdy help, were gradually replaced by murmurs about her strength of character. She was the woman who had bluffed Thorn into submission, the woman who had helped save her own ranch not once, but twice. The next time they drove the wagon into town, the change was palpable. A few of the townsfolk, Men who had previously offered only sidelong glances gave Silas a respectful dip of their heads. Mrs. Miller, the sheriff's wife, who had once stared at Alara with undisguised curiosity, now offered a small, hesitant smile as they passed on the boardwalk. It was not a grand welcome, but for Alara, who had known only judgment in public spaces, these small gestures of acceptance were like a healing balm. For the first time, she walked the single dusty street of redemption with her head held high, not in defiance, but in the quiet confidence of a woman who was beginning to feel she belonged. With the immediate threat from Thorn neutralized and the creek flowing freely once more, their focus returned to their land and to each other. The seasons began to turn, the harsh heat of summer slowly giving way to the golden light and crisp air of autumn. The work was still hard, a constant, demanding cycle of chores from sunup to sundown, but it was no longer a desperate struggle for survival or a frantic effort to prove one's worth. It was a shared labor of love, a daily act of building a life together. They fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm, their lives becoming so deeply intertwined that it was hard to remember a time when they had been two separate, solitary people. The small log house, once a shelter of convenience, became a true home, filled with the quiet hum of their shared existence. Silas, seeing the joy she took in the animals, decided it was time she learned to properly ride a horse, not just perch on its back for a trip to town. He chose the gentlest mare, the one with the lame leg that Alara had so patiently tended, and spent hours in the corral with her. He taught her how to move with the horse, to become a part of its rhythm, to communicate not with force but with a gentle pressure of the knees and a soft touch on the reins. He discovered she had a natural, calm affinity for the animals. They trusted her steady presence. He also taught her how to handle a rifle. It was not for sport, but for the grim necessity of a life lived on the frontier. He showed her how to load it, how to sight it, how to clean it, his large, capable hands guiding her own. When she took her first shot at a rusty can set on a fence post, her hand was surprisingly steady, and she hit it squarely. He looked at her with a deep, abiding respect. She was a woman who could nurture a dying calf back to life and also hold a rifle with an unwavering aim. She was a woman made for this land. In return, Alara slowly, gently, coaxed Silas out of the last vestiges of his deep-seated solemnity. The grief was a part of him. She knew, a landscape he would always carry within him. But she began to plant small seeds of joy in that barren soil. In the evenings, as they sat by the fire, she would tell him stories of her life back in the city, painting vivid pictures of crowded streets and gas lights and people rushing everywhere. She had a wry, observant sense of humor, and she would make him laugh, a sound that at first was rusty and unused, but which gradually became a warm, rich rumble that filled the small house. She filled the silence with music, not from an instrument, but from her own throat, humming the old folk tunes her mother had once sung as she went about her work. The simple, wordless melodies were a constant, soothing presence, a gentle counterpoint to the mournful cry of the wind outside. One quiet afternoon in late autumn, when the leaves of the cottonwood trees by the creek had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold, Silas took her by the hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice soft. He led her out of the house and up the small, wind-swept hill to the two wooden crosses that stood silhouetted against the vast blue sky. It was a place she had only ever seen from a distance, the heart of his private sorrow. She felt a moment of trepidation, as if she were trespassing on sacred ground. But this time, it was not a place of silent, painful memory. He was not gazing at it from afar. Trapped in his grief, he was bringing her into it. He sat down on the dry, rustling grass and pulled her down beside him. For a long time, he was quiet, not with a tense, brooding silence, but with a contemplative peace. "Her laugh was the first thing I noticed," he began, his voice a low murmur. It was not a dainty, polite laugh. It was loud and free. She said it was unladylike, but I thought it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He was talking about Mary. He spoke of her not as a sainted, tragic figure, but as a living, breathing woman. He told Alara how Mary had hated the wind but loved the endless sunsets, how she had been terrified of snakes but could calm a spooked horse with a single touch, how she had dreamed of planting an orchard of apple trees on the south-facing slope. Then he spoke of Jacob. His voice grew thick with a father's love as he described his son's all-consuming fascination with grasshoppers, how the boy would spend hours squatting in the tall grass, trying to catch them in a jar. He told her about the time Jacob had tried to help him mend a fence and had ended up with more nails in his pockets than in the posts, about the funny, nonsensical songs the boy would make up as he played. He was not just sharing the story of their deaths. He was sharing the vibrant, joyful story of their lives. He was taking the precious, guarded memories of the people he had loved and lost and placing them gently into her hands. He was inviting her into his entire history, the beautiful and the tragic, making her a part of it all. As he spoke, tears began to stream down his face. But they were not the silent, wrenching sobs of a man broken by guilt. They were the open, honest tears of a man mourning a profound loss, and he shed them without shame. Alara did not speak. She simply moved closer, wrapped her arms around his trembling shoulders, and held him. She was offering comfort not as a replacement for the woman who lay beneath the soil, but as a witness to his past and a steadfast partner in his future. The act of sharing his most profound pain, of allowing her into the most sacred and wounded part of his heart, was a final, complete act of trust. It was the ultimate declaration of his love. A few weeks later, a glimmer of new hope emerged. Quiet and tentative at first, Alara had been feeling a deep, persistent exhaustion for some time, a weariness that settled into her bones. She had attributed it to the hard work of the ranch, to the long days and the emotional toll of the past months. But then she missed her monthly course, and a slow, dawning realization began to take hold. One morning, a wave of nausea sent her rushing out the door. Standing in the crisp morning air, with her heart pounding in her chest, she knew she was pregnant. The discovery brought with it a wave of joy so fierce and so pure it was almost painful. A child, their child, a new life, forged in this harsh land, a product of their unlikely love. But immediately on the heels of that joy came a chilling, terrifying fear. Ilara's old insecurities, the ones she thought she had finally conquered, surfaced in a new and frightening guise. The voice of her aunt echoed in her mind, not with taunts about her size, but with a more insidious question. What did she know of being a mother? She, who had never truly known a mother's love herself, whose own mother had been taken from her before she could form any lasting memories beyond a soft voice and a book of recipes. Could she, who had been raised on criticism and neglect, provide the unconditional love and gentle guidance a child needed? The fear that she would fail, that she would be found wanting in this most essential of tasks, was a cold knot in her stomach. When she told Silas, his reaction was a far more complex and violent emotional blow. He stood by the kitchen table, his hand resting on the wood, and for a moment, an expression of pure, unadulterated joy illuminated his face, making him look younger than she had ever seen him. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a shadow so dark and so profound it seemed to suck all the light from the room. The joy was real, but it was instantly eclipsed by the paralyzing, visceral terror of his past trauma. To love another child, to be responsible for another fragile, precious life in this land that had already taken everything from him once. The thought was almost more than he could bear. The ghosts of the past, which had become quiet, peaceful memories, were suddenly reawakened, howling with warnings of loss and pain. His fear manifested as a frantic, controlling anxiety. He became protective to an extreme that bordered on suffocation. He forbade her from lifting anything heavier than a dinner plate. He took over the care of the chickens, insisting the work was too strenuous for her. He even tried to stop her from tending her small, recovering garden, the place where she found so much peace. He was trying to wrap her, and the new life she carried, in cotton wool, to protect them from a world he knew to be merciless and unpredictable. The trauma of losing his first family was threatening to poison the happiness of his second. Ilara understood. With her newfound strength and her deep, empathetic understanding of her husband, she recognized his fear for what it was, the desperate, terrified cry of a wounded heart. She allowed it for a few days, but when he tried to stop her from kneading the daily bread, her hands a comforting and familiar presence in the dough, she knew she had to confront him. She took his large hands, the ones that were trying to build a cage of safety around her, and held them firmly in her own. She did not meet his fear with anger, but with a deep and abiding compassion. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Look at me." He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a desperate, haunted terror. "This child," she said, placing one of his hands on her still flat belly, "is a new beginning. It is not a ghost of the past. What happened to Mary and Jacob was a terrible tragedy, but it is not a prophecy. We cannot protect our child from life by being afraid to live it. We will be careful. We will be wise, but we will not be afraid." She looked at him, her love for him shining in her eyes. "We will face whatever comes, just as we always have, together." Her words, spoken with such calm, compassionate strength, broke through the paralysis of his fear. He looked at her steady gaze and the unwavering love in her eyes, and he understood. His fear was not a shield. It was a cage, a prison he was building for her, for their child, and for himself. He saw that true protection did not come from avoiding all risk, but from facing the future with courage and love. He did not speak. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her, burying his face in her hair. That night, he seemed to have made a decision. The next morning, after the morning chores, he disappeared into his small workshop in the barn, a place where he mended harnesses and repaired tools. He stayed in there for several days, working from dawn until well after dusk. The sounds of sawing and sanding and hammering drifted from the barn, but when she asked him what he was making, he would only smile a small, mysterious smile and say, "You will see." At the end of the week, he emerged from the workshop. He walked toward the house, his steps slow and deliberate, and in his arms, he carried his creation. It was a cradle. It was the most beautiful thing Ilara had ever seen. He had crafted it with his own hands from the pale, smooth wood of the cottonwood tree that stood by the creek, the one whose leaves turned to gold in the autumn. The design was simple but elegant, the rockers perfectly curved, the spindles smooth and even. He had sanded the wood until it felt like silk beneath her fingers. He brought it into the main room and set it gently on the floor beside the hearth, in the warm space that had once been occupied by Mary's rocking chair. He turned to Ilara, his face filled with an emotion so profound it seemed to shake him to his core. His voice was thick, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. "There is something I did not tell you about that tree," he said, his eyes finding hers. "Mary and I, we planted it together. From a sapling, the first spring we were here, we planted it to mark a beginning." He reached out and took her hand, his gaze dropping to her stomach, then returning to her face. "Now," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it will hold our new beginning. Our child will not replace the son I lost. Nothing ever could. But they will add to this family. They will bring life back to this place. They will bring life back to me." The cradle was not just a piece of furniture. It was a physical symbol of his healing. It was a perfect, beautiful fusion of his past and his future, a testament to the fact that new life could grow from the same soil that held deep sorrow. In that moment, as he stood before her, offering this profound gift, he fully accepted the coming child not as a risk to be feared, but as a blessing to be cherished. His love for Elara, and for the unborn baby they had created together, had finally, truly, overcome the darkest shadow of his grief. The final months of Elara's pregnancy settled into a period of quiet, joyful anticipation. The heavy, oppressive silence that had once saturated the ranch was now a distant memory, replaced by a palpable sense of hope that seemed to hum in the very air. The log house, once a mere shelter from the elements, was now a true home, filled with the warmth of their love and the promise of the new life it held. The cradle Silas had built sat by the hearth, its smooth, pale wood seeming to glow in the firelight, a constant, beautiful reminder of their future. Their place in the community of redemption continued to shift and solidify. After one of their trips to town, a wagon rattled up their long, winding track. It was Dr. Miller's wife, a kind, practical woman named Martha, with a warm smile and eyes that held no judgment. She had brought a small bundle of baby clothes her own children had outgrown, and a jar of her finest peach preserves. "I thought you might have some use for these," she said, her voice straightforward and kind. "And a woman in your condition needs a little sweetness now and again." That first visit turned into a regular occurrence. Martha would ride out every week or so, bringing news from town, practical advice about childbirth and babies, and, most importantly, the simple, uncomplicated gift of friendship. For Elara, who had never had a true female friend in her life. Their afternoons spent talking over cups of tea were a revelation. They spoke of everything and nothing, of recipes and remedies, of the hardships of ranch life, of their hopes for the future. In Martha's company, Elara found a comfort and a validation she had never known, her own quiet confidence blossoming under the warm sun of another woman's acceptance. Her place in the community was no longer just a role she filled. It was a connection she felt, a thread in a larger tapestry. It seemed as though the harsh western landscape itself was conspiring to nurture the new life growing on the ranch. The fierce, unpredictable weather of the past seasons gave way to a gentle, forgiving summer. The rains came soft and steady, not in violent downpours, turning the pastures a lush, deep green. The creek, their hard-won lifeline, flowed full and clear. Elara's garden, which she now tended with a slow and careful grace, overflowed with a bounty of vegetables, its vibrant life a testament to her patient, nurturing hands. Silas, having passed through the fire of his own fear, was a man transformed. His earlier terror was replaced by a deep, protective tenderness that manifested not in anxious hovering, but in 1,000 small, thoughtful gestures. He mended the loose step on the porch without her having to ask. He brought her a cushion for her chair when her back ached. He would watch her as she worked, a soft, wondering look in his eyes that made her feel beautiful, cherished. In the quiet evenings, he would sit beside her, placing a gentle, calloused hand on her growing belly. He would talk to the baby, his voice, usually so rough and reserved, softening into a gentle, melodic rumble, full of a wonder she had never heard before. He told the baby stories, not of people, but of the land it would be born into. He spoke of the cry of the red-tailed hawk and the wisdom of the coyote, of how to read the clouds to predict the weather, and of the unyielding strength of the ancient cottonwood tree that had given its wood for the cradle. He was introducing his child to its home, its heritage, weaving it into the fabric of the land before it had even drawn its first breath. The day came with a sudden, unexpected violence. The birth, like so much of their life together, was destined to be a trial, a final, brutal test of their endurance. It began in the late afternoon, just as a dark, bruised-looking bank of clouds began to gather on the western horizon. A sudden storm, fierce and unseasonal, rolled in from the plains, mirroring the blizzard that had once nearly destroyed them. The sky turned a sickly green-black. The wind began to howl, and the rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. Silas had ridden for the doctor at the first sign of labor, but the storm had turned the dry creek beds into raging torrents and the roads into impassable rivers of mud. He returned hours later, alone, his face grim, soaked to the bone. The doctor was delayed, trapped on the other side of the flooded river. For a long, terrifying period, it was just the two of them, alone again in the small house, facing a primal, life-or-death struggle against the backdrop of a raging storm. Ilara's labor was long and difficult, her pain a relentless, crashing wave. But this time, Silas was not helpless. He was not the emotionally frozen, grief-stricken man she had first met. He was a pillar of unwavering strength. He remembered every instruction the doctor and Martha had given him. He kept the fire roaring, boiled water, and held Ilara's hand, his grip a firm, unbreakable anchor in her sea of pain. His voice was a constant, reassuring presence, a low, steady murmur through her agony. He wiped her brow, gave her sips of water, and spoke to her of their future, of the child they were fighting for, his words a lifeline she clung to. He was no longer a man haunted by the past, but a fully present, loving husband, fighting with every fiber of his being alongside his wife. Just as her strength began to fail, just as a sliver of true, cold despair began to creep into the room, there was a frantic pounding on the door. It was Martha. Her face was pale and streaked with rain, her hair plastered to her head, but her eyes were calm and determined. She had ridden through the worst of the storm herself, refusing to leave Ilara to face this alone. With Martha's practiced, gentle guidance, the tide began to turn, and then, in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, as the storm outside finally began to recede, a new sound cut through the rumble of the thunder. It was a cry, a thin, reedy, but powerful proclamation of a new life. A healthy baby girl, exhausted, trembling, and weeping with a relief so profound it felt like a physical release. Ilara watched as Silas, his large hands surprisingly gentle, wrapped their daughter in a clean, soft blanket. He brought the swaddled infant to the bed and placed her carefully into Ilara's waiting arms. That moment was the culmination of their entire journey. They looked at each other over their daughter's tiny, perfect head, their eyes filled with tears of exhaustion, relief, and a love so deep and so complete it needed no words. In a place that had once been defined by death and sorrow, in a house that had been haunted by absence, they had created new life. An epilogue of peace and quiet joy unfolded over the following year. The ranch thrived under their shared care. The house was no longer quiet. It was filled now with the happy gurgles, contented sighs, and occasional angry squalls of their daughter, whom they named Rose. Silas was a doting, utterly captivated father. The weathered stoic mask he had worn for so long was gone, his face now quick to soften into a tender, loving smile every time he held his child. He would come in from the fields, his hands still dirty with the soil of his land, and his first act would be to lift Rose from her cradle, his large, rough finger a marvel against her tiny, perfect hand. Ilara, too, had fully come into her own. The last traces of the insecure, apologetic woman who had stepped off the train had vanished forever. She was a confident wife, a loving, intuitive mother, and a respected, indispensable partner in the ranch's success. Her love for Silas and Rose was a deep, unshakable foundation upon which she had built a life of purpose and joy. The theme of prejudice, the ghost that had haunted her for so long, was confronted one last time, not with a dramatic showdown, but with the quiet finality of a closing door. They were in redemption for supplies, a year or so after Rose's birth. Ilara was standing on the boardwalk, holding Rose in her arms, while Silas loaded sacks of flour into the back of the wagon. A new family, just arrived from the east, walked by. They were dressed in fine, city clothes that looked out of place in the dusty western town. The woman, her face pinched with a prim disapproval, took one look at Ilara's sturdy frame and the simple, practical cut of her calico dress, and made a quiet but clearly audible comment to her husband. "Goodness," she sniffed. It does not take long for these country wives to let themselves go. A year ago, 2 years ago, the comment would have been a dagger to Alara's heart, shattering her fragile sense of self-worth. Now, she felt only a distant, fleeting flicker of pity for the woman's small, narrow world. She glanced at her own reflection in the general store window. She saw not a fat girl, but a strong, healthy, capable woman with a beautiful, thriving baby in her arms. She saw a woman whose body had endured hardship and brought forth life, a body that was loved and cherished. She then looked over at her husband. He had heard the comment, and his eyes had gone cold and hard, but he caught her gaze, and seeing the calm strength in her expression, he relaxed. He gave her a warm, private smile, a look that needed no words, a look that said she was his home, his partner, his entire world. Her self-worth was no longer a fragile thing, dependent on the shifting winds of other people's opinions. It was a deep, unshakable foundation, built of love, resilience, and hard-won accomplishment. Alara simply smiled, a genuine, contented smile, and turned her attention back to her daughter, who was reaching for a loose strand of her hair. The cruel, thoughtless words of the stranger dissolved into the dusty air, completely and utterly powerless. The final, most profound climax of their story came not in a storm or a confrontation, but in a moment of perfect, quiet peace. It was a late summer evening. The day's work was done. The sun was setting, painting the immense western sky in brilliant, breathtaking hues of orange, purple, and gold. Alara was at the stove, gently stirring a pot of hearty beef stew. The rich, savory scent filled the warm, lamp-lit kitchen, the scent of home, of comfort, of family. She was humming a soft, familiar lullaby. In her cradle by the hearth, the one Silas had built from the wood of the memory tree, Rose was fast asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Silas entered the house, moving with the quiet footsteps of a man at peace in his own home. He was weary from a long day in the fields, but a deep contentment settled in his eyes as he took in the scene. He did not sit at the table to wait for his meal, as he once had. Instead, he walked up silently behind Alara. She sensed him there and leaned back slightly, a silent invitation. He wrapped his powerful arms around her waist, fitting himself against her back. He rested his hands on top of hers on the wooden spoon, his touch warm and familiar. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her hair and the rich aroma of the food she was making for their family. They stood like that for a long, quiet moment, perfectly still, watching together as the last of the brilliant light faded from the sky outside their window. He tightened his embrace, holding her as if she were the anchor of his world. He leaned in close, his voice a low, rough whisper next to her ear, filled with an emotion that was years in the making. "You brought the life back to this place, Alara," he said, the words a simple, profound truth. "You brought it back to me. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.